After the fall of the Soviet Union and until present day, the Russian armed forces have struggled to modernize and change into a modern fighting force. Conflicts and lack of funds have hampered this, together with a reluctance to move away from the Red Army doctrine. This video will map the changes of the Russian Federation's armed forces from 1991 until present day, and what can be said about the future. During this period, the Soviet Union was falling apart. Several republics declared independence, or were going in that direction. The Red Army were being transferred back to Russia. In 1991, a military coup was attempted by the remnants of the Communist Party to try and avoid the total collapse of the Soviet Union. It failed, and Boris Yeltsin appeared as the new leader. Between 1994 to 1996, the First Chechen War was fought, which would challenge the Russian army and show several weaknesses in material, men, communication, and morale. With the fall of the Soviet Union and the disbandment of the Warsaw Pact, the new Russian Federation would have a superpower army with the funds of a small economy. It would see a large influx of units previously stationed in Eastern Europe redeployed back to Russia. Around 600,000 soldiers had been stationed in East Europe, most in what was then East Germany or DDR. As late as 1994, the last troops departed the unified Germany and the Baltic countries. $5 billion were provided by the German state for housing the returning soldiers inside Russia, but less than half of the 46,000 apartments supposed to be built were built. These units would return to army bases that could simply be a field. There were no facilities to house them, lack of sanitation, the pay was low, and morale was a big problem. In this period, several hundred thousands of officers left the army. The conscripts, the backbone of the Red Army, started failing in Russia. In 1994, only 27% turned up for service. In 1998, that number had fallen to 17%. The army would be reduced from around 4 million down to 1 million during this period. In the early parts of the decade, there were few actual military reforms, even though suggestions about modernization and streamlining the armed forces surfaced. The budget for the Ministry of Defense, or MOD, was capped at 3.5% of the GDP. The problem was that the GDP was very low, so not much money was available. In 1990, about 60% of the budget went to salaries, housing, and uniforms. In theory, by 1994, the Russian Federation had on paper some 70 divisions. In reality, they had problems getting a force together for the First Chechen War. In 1992, the budget was $47 billion. By 1998, it reached a low point of approximately $16 billion. That would increase by the end of the period to $17.5 billion. This is calculated in the dollar value of 2019. The most significant reform was simply reducing the number of serving personnel. In 1999, it had gone down to approximately 1 million. The aim was to modernize the force, but lacking funds stopped any meaningful reforms. In 1997, Igor Sergeyev became the Minister of Defense, and he started to make some strides to reorganize the army. The aim was to have at least some units in permanent readiness. The concept optimization under a nuclear shield came into being. In general, it was a reduction of the armed forces to release funds needed for reforms. In 1992, the armed forces had 5 services: ground, air, air defense, naval, and strategic missile forces. That was reduced to 4 services, with the air and air defense being combined. The financial crisis of 1998 would halt any benefits from these early reforms. The defense budget lost about 2.5 times its value. The army had been reduced, but it had not gained any real combat ability. The lack of funds after 1991 would severely impact the Russian army during this period. Defense production would be cut by 80%, military hardware cut by 90%, and civilian parts would be cut by 75%. The lack of funds would hinder the development of new projects. Research and development continued but much reduced, and the defense industry would see a huge loss of qualified personnel. No real modernization or little new equipment came out from the Russian defense industry in this period. The lack of funds would also hamper maintenance of stored military hardware. However, in 1992, the first version of the battle tank T-90 would come into service. The main conflict during this period was the First Chechen War, fought between 1994 to 96. It would expose many shortfalls in the Russian armed forces. The background was as follows. In 1993, the Checheno-Ingush Autonomous Republic split in 2 parts, and by 1993, the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria declared independence. An internal opposition formed against this, which initiated the Russian intervention. The 70 or so divisions the Russian army had on paper was just that. They had to cobble together units to create a force. This included many conscripts that just had started their service. It was a disorganized force that entered Chechnya. Tank drivers trained on the T-72 were placed to drive the T-80 and vice versa. Tanks brought out of storage that theoretically should take 1 day to make combat ready would take 9 days, and often break down soon after they were put into service. By the 31st of December, the Russian forces had managed a weak ring around the capital Grozny, and planned to conquer the city via 4 axes in maximum 5 to 6 days. Little planning seems to have gone into the attack, and they were hampered by a lack of communication on all levels. The operation came apart quickly. The 503rd Regiment stated simply it was not ready to attack. the 74th Brigade stopped to celebrate New Year's Eve. The 81st Regiment was ambushed northeast of the train station. Meanwhile, the 131st Brigade, unaware of the 81st Regiment's ambush, drove in column down to the train station, where soldiers disembarked and started planning their trip home before they also were ambushed. In a battle between the 1st and the 3rd of January, the 131st Brigade lost 20 out of 26 tanks and 102 out of 120 armored vehicles. Russian forces turned to artillery and airstrikes, and it would take 1 month until they had finally captured the city. By 1995, the Russian forces had control over most cities, while Chechen fighters started hitting civilian targets inside Russia. In 1996, Boris Yeltsin would declare a Russian victory. The same year, on the 6th of August, Chechen fighters infiltrated the capital, took over it in one day, and encircled large bodies of Russian troops. Attempts to break into them failed, with heavy Russian casualties. That led up to an agreement that would keep Chechnya inside the Russian Federation on paper, but in reality it was a failed but independent state. Some 6,000 Russian soldiers were killed, 3,000 to 4,000 Chechen rebels, and perhaps up to 80,000 civilians killed. The war would show a Russian army lacking planning, manpower, air-ground collaboration, and military hardware maintenance. It would also show a repeating pattern for the Russian army. If stalled, it would quickly turn to artillery shelling with little regards for civilian casualties. Winning by numbers, not by tactical brilliance. Boris Yeltsin had handed over power to Vladimir Putin, who had been acting president in 1999 and would become the sitting president between 2000 and 2008. The major conflict during this period was the Second Chechen War, which started in 1999 and would end in 2009. The Russian economy would increase, and the GDP would grow on average 7% per year, giving additional funds to the Russian armed forces. In 2002, about 400,000 officers had left the army since 1991. About 10 to 30% of the officer positions were vacant. Conscripts turning up for service had dropped down to 11%. Sergei Ivanov, the Minister of Defense between 2001 to 2007, stated in 2006 the need for a professional force with the aim of 70% contract soldiers and the rest conscripts by 2008. To free up funds, the army would be reduced by 100,000 men. It was an over-optimistic goal, as the aim was still to have an armed force of approximately 1 million men, making it an equation difficult to solve. In 2005, 30% of the armed forces were contract soldiers. In 2006, a conscript had $3 per month, and they served for 2 years. During that time, they would be subjected to bullying and hazing from second-year conscripts, which could end up in fatalities. The conscript period would be reduced to 1 year in 2008. Between 2004 to 2007, a new NCO or non-commissioned officer class was created, mimicking Western armies. Around 100,000 positions had been filled by 2008. However, low salaries, bad housing still hampered the creation of a mostly professional army. With a better economy, fueled by the energy sector, the budget went from $23.5 billion in 2000 to $46 billion by 2008, calculated in the dollar value of 2019. And with more funds, reforms could be made. The biggest change in doctrine was probably the white paper published by the Minister of Defense, Sergei Ivanov, titled "The Priority Tasks of the Development of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation." It outlined future conflicts and would be important in the next 20+ years. It stated the Russian concept of hybrid warfare, which included, among other things, the initial phase will dictate the outcome of a conflict. Military, political, economy, and populations are all primary targets. Airborne troops have an increased importance. Air power and long-range missiles have increased in importance. Collaboration and joint commands of air and ground forces are essential. Anti-aircraft systems are essential. Large tank and infantry clashes are replaced by missiles and long-range weapon systems. Organizational changes included the reduction of active military units from the 1,890 that were active at this time. The military districts would be replaced by 4 Joint Strategic Commands, or OSK. By 2008, only 20% of the units were combat ready, and the aim was to increase that percentage. The nuclear deterrent force would still receive priority over conventional forces, which would hinder or delay the restructuring of the conventional forces. No major overhaul of the Russian armed forces took place during this period, even though it somewhat laid the groundwork for future reforms. With a bigger budget, the aging Russian military hardware could be addressed, or at least they could start addressing it. To implement this, they used the State Program of Armament, or GPV, which usually runs for 10 years, with updates in between. This program covers modernization, procurement, and R&D. The GPV between 1996 to 2005 had struggled with funding and only met somewhere around 20% of its stated targets. In 2002, they initiated GPV 2010. This program aimed to start with research and development, and in 2008 they would switch to procurement of new military hardware. By 2010, procurement would be the only goal of this program. 4 years later, GPV 2015 was initiated, running from 2007 to 2015, with some lofty goals. By 2025, the Russian army would have 70% modern weapons and 30% older weapon systems. This would require 5% per year to achieve. However, they only reached 2% during this period. A large part of the available funds would still go to the nuclear deterrent force. Some figures state about 50%, which would make it difficult to modernize the conventional Russian armed forces. As an example, between 2000 and 2004, the armed forces only received 15 new tanks, a very small number when the force active and in storage were 23,000 tanks. In 2006, the Russian armed forces had a ratio of 20% modern weapons and 80% older weapon systems. Old systems was in this case old Soviet-era hardware. The main conflict during this period was the Second Chechen War. It started in 1999 and would be waged until 2009. Background. In 1999, Chechen rebels invaded Dagestan, intending to create a new Islamic Republic. Dagestan resisted with Russian aid, and the Chechen rebels were driven back. Between the 6th and the 13th of September, several bombs exploded in Moscow, attributed to Chechen terrorists. If they were responsible is probable but not certain. It would follow their previous strategy, but in this case they did not take responsibility, which they usually did. There is a possibility that this was a false flag operation to give a casus belli. What is known is that the Chechen state had failed, and it was perhaps better described as a warlord state. Unlike the first war, this war had great support inside Russia, and the Russian army was better prepared. Around 100,000 soldiers had time to train before the invasion. The Russian armed forces slowly encircled Chechnya, and then advanced using long-range artillery and airstrikes. Urban areas were first warned, then if rebels were present, it was leveled, with little regards for civilian casualties. They also used proxy forces to secure and occupy terrain. Even so, their grasp of the country was weak, and guerrilla strikes and terrorist acts continued all through the conflict. The population, growing tired of war and violence, was not 100% behind the rebels, as they had been during the First War. The great financial crisis in 2008 would strike, causing a great reduction of the Russian budget. 2009 would be a particularly bad year, with the economy contracting almost 8%, to later slowly rebound. The war in Georgia would be the major military conflict of this period. The lack of money would impact manpower and the suggested reforms. The status of the army was still not good in 2008. Bad housing, bad medical care and low wages all contributed to this. A lieutenant had about 2/3 of the average salary, and a conscript got $18 per month. The main problem for the army was too many officers. Around half to 1/3 of the total force were officers. Too many cooks for the pot, as it were. To combat this ineffective ratio, it was decided to reduce the officer corps from 355,000 down to 150,000. In 2009, that was revised back to 220,000 officers. The warrant officer class of about 140,000 men were abolished. In 2011, the plan for the army was as follows. Of a total force of 900,000, some 425,000 would be contract soldiers and NCOs, and 276,000 would be conscripts. No timetable was set for when this would be accomplished. The low pay and the demographics would make the Russian army struggle to meet these goals and get qualified personnel to join. The budget would see a dip in 2009 as the financial crisis hit, but it would soon rebound, and by 2012 the Russian MOD budget had increased to $61 billion, from $46 billion in 2008, based on the dollar value of 2019. Several reforms would be started during this period. The main one was perhaps that the brigade would be the new standard unit, instead of the division. The number of military units would be reduced from 1,890 in 2008 to 172 by 2012. This would include 80 combat-ready brigades. By 2009, all 80 brigades had been formed. In 2010, the old-style military districts became the 4 Joint Strategic Commands, OSK. They were West, East, South and Central. For each strategic command, an airborne brigade would be formed as a rapid deployment force. The aim was to increase the combat readiness that somewhat still hovered around 20% in 2008. The Air Force would also see a reduction in bases and units to achieve better combat readiness and reduce the administrative overhead. The Russian armed forces still lacked modern weapons. The ratio was 20% modern and 80% older weapons. The inverted ratio compared to a Western force. In 2008, the plan was still to have 80 to 100% modern weapons by 2020. But by the next year, that was lowered to 70% modern weapons by 2020. The problem was the ineffective domestic Russian arms industry, more than the lack of funds. So they started looking outside the country for a quicker way to modernize its forces. In 2010, an agreement for unmanned UVA was signed with Israel. French Mistral landing ships were considered, and if they could not deliver, many other countries were considered. They approached Germany to provide simulation systems and armored vehicles. They also approached Italy for armored vehicles. The Second Chechen War was ended in 2009 by Russia. Ramzan Kadyrov, supporting Russia, had been put in power as head of the Chechen Republic. This did not end the violence in the republic, but it saw the end of active Russian army intervention. Russian casualties had been around 7,000 to 8,000 killed, but might have been substantially higher. Chechen rebels killed between 16,000 to 17,000. The civilian death toll is harder to estimate, anywhere from 30,000 up to 200,000, depending on the source. The main new conflict would be the 2008 war in Georgia. After Georgia declared independence in 1991, South Ossetia and Abkhazia closer to Russia broke away and fighting erupted in the region, it ending in an unstable peace with peacekeepers from Georgia, Russia and Ossetia. After 2000, Georgia was moving closer to West Europe and NATO, so the conflict flared up again. Russia aimed to get total control over Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and to be able to establish Russian naval, air and ground bases in the area. The military planning was to overwhelm the Georgian defenses and reach a quick victory. First, they would take control over South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and to also get air supremacy. The Russian army started repairing the railways in Abkhazia in 2008 to be able to move heavy military equipment. The Russian military was and is still a railway-based force. Russian forces in the region started to be reinforced. In 2008, they held a military exercise, Caucasus 2008, with at least 8,000 troops and some 80 aircraft taking part. This was probably a rehearsal for the coming operation. On the 1st of August, the Russian army launched its attack with at least 20,000 troops. They quickly achieved their targets, more from numbers than any technical superiority in hardware or tactics. The Russian Air Force would have problems eliminating the Georgian Air Force, and that would continue flying until the last day of the conflict. The ground forces had older equipment like the T-62 and T-72, and they did not perform well from a technical aspect with multiple breakdowns. They also had communication problems, with some instances of journalists' satellite phones being used by the Russian military. The Russian soldiers taking part, now a higher degree of contract soldiers, would see a Russian force conduct itself better. The Georgian forces were better armed, had better nighttime systems, and outperformed the Russian army one-on-one, but they did not have the numbers. The conflict officially lasted from the 1st to the 12th of August, but Russian hostilities lasted until the end of August. In the number of casualties, both military and civilian, it was far from the war in Chechnya. The military losses for all sides were around 500 killed, and something similar for the number of civilian deaths. The Russian armed forces again won with numbers, having several fundamental problems in hardware and communication. But the planning had improved since the first Chechen war. A reformed constitution would see Putin become president again. The main event during this period were the failure to bring Ukraine closer to Russia, the annexation of Crimea, and instigating a civil war in the Donbas region. Sanctions would slow down the Russian armed forces reforms. It would also see the concept of hybrid warfare being used to a higher degree than before. By 2022, they would launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, exposing many deficiencies of the Russian armed forces. The aim to create a Western-style NCO force, or non-commissioned officer, had met with little success. The high turnaround of contract soldiers meant it was difficult to implement such a cadre, probably due to the historical lack of NCOs in the Russian army and its predecessor, the Red Army. By 2017, the goal was 425,000 contract soldiers, but that goal was not met. Instead, a force of 476,000 soldiers by 2025 was the new goal. Severe hazing still occurred within the armed forces. That probably led to problems recruiting and retaining contract soldiers. A conscript would get $30 per month and a contract soldier $900 per month. Some conscripts would get the option to do 2 years as a contract soldier instead of a conscript, but it is doubtful if a high number of those would remain in the service after those 2 years. Conditions had improved, but they still faced several problems. Contract soldiers and conscripts seldom mixed, making the possible reserves from conscript soldiers problematic. The lack of adequate reserves was also a problem identified by the Russian army. The reserve force of previously serving members of the armed forces were around 2 million. However, few of them have had any refresher training within 5 years after leaving the service, no more than 10%. The active reserve was then estimated at maybe between 4,000 to 5,000 men. The Russian Combat Army Reserve, or BARS 2021, aimed to have 80,000 to 100,000 reservists that would get ongoing refresher training. It is unknown how well that program performed, but the data would suggest not that great. One city planning for 220 reservists got 1. It is estimated that they had about 9,000 reservists in January 2022 from the BRS 2022 program. The military budget would continue to increase during this period. It reached a peak in 2016 with approximately $80 billion. After that, the budget would fall down to $62 billion in 2018, and then start growing again, reaching between $66 to $69 billion, around 4.1% of the GDP. The nuclear deterrent force is still a priority, and that has made modernization of the conventional forces slow and less effective. In 2015, the services in the Russian armed forces now consisted of 3 services: ground, navy and aerospace, plus 2 independent arms: strategic missile troops and airborne troops. By 2021, the organization of 4 joint strategic commands from 2010 had been expanded to 5. They were now West, North, South, Center and East. Otherwise, reforms already put in place during the previous periods were ongoing. The BTG, or Battalion Tactical Group, started to become more important. It was really nothing new. It had already been used during the Soviet Union. It is a mission-oriented formation based around a battalion, maybe between 750 to 1,000 men, perhaps 10 tanks and very much heavy artillery, more artillery than a brigade-sized units in Western armies. However, it has less infantry, around 200 of the total force. This tactical unit would be the standard unit inside the Russian army. So you would see BTGs formed from several brigades without the brigade itself being deployed. The annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbas region would see some of the Western procurement fall through, like the Mistral-class amphibious assault ships. The domestic arms industry was simultaneously struggling with delivering new weapon systems. As an example, the new main battle tank, the T-14 Armata, unveiled in 2015, and it was expected to be deployed by 2020, with some 2,300 new tanks. Problems with design and delays reduced that to 100 tanks, then down to 20 tanks, to be delivered as a test batch. It is unclear if that has been delivered as of 2022. The fifth generation combat aircraft, the Su-57, is estimated to have 24 deployed by 2025. Previous, current and future sanctions, especially in the technology area, will pose increased problems for Russia. Especially modernization and R&D will suffer. Most modernization have been to old-style Soviet tanks, like the T-72. The T-72B3, modernized in 2011 and 2016, is the current most prolific tank in the Russian army. New attack and fighter airplanes like the Su-30, the Su-34, and early small batches of the MiG-35 have come into service. The war in Ukraine would be the major conflict in this period and beyond. The background to this conflict is part of the hybrid war concept. It started with the political aspect. In 2010, Yanukovych won the presidential election in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Ukraine was inching closer to the EU. A proposed EU-Ukrainian association agreement had been confirmed by the Ukrainian parliament. But in 2013, Yanukovych rejected that and instead favored the Eurasian Economic Union, in other words, closer ties to Russia. Large protests broke out, and around 100 demonstrators and police were killed. Yanukovych agreed to early elections, but the day after fled after an impeachment seemed likely. Yanukovych would surface in Russia, claiming still to be the president of Ukraine. Meanwhile, Russian forces were springing into action. Days later, on the 20th of February 2014, Russian forces, the Little Green Men, took over Crimea's key locations from a Ukrainian army not ready for a conflict. It became a bloodless action, and the peninsula was occupied and, in Russian rhetoric, annexed. The reason was probably not only because of Ukraine's move towards the EU. The Russian naval base in Sevastopol would also have to be closed by 2017, when the agreement between Russia and Ukraine ran out. That also probably played a part in the war. In March, the unrest in the Donbas region started, fueled by Russian agents in the area. Russian forces used hybrid warfare, now combining both political propaganda and proxy forces, together with regular forces in the region. Conventional Russian units would see action in the Donbas region, when the proxy forces seemed likely to lose. The Ukrainian army was underfunded and had old military hardware, so it struggled in the Donbas region. Several Ukrainian volunteer units would take part in the fighting. The Russian proxy forces and the Russian army would not achieve their goals of capturing the whole region. So an uneasy stalemate would ensue until 2022, when Russia would launch a conventional invasion of Ukraine. In general, the Russian armed forces used the hybrid war concept to great effect during this part of the conflict, but it also showed some weaknesses in the Donbas region. The Russian invasion of Ukraine 2022. Russian forces started massing around the Ukrainian borders. Part of it disguised as a military exercise in Belarus. On the 24th of February 2022, the full invasion was launched, and most of the lessons the Russian army had learned previously were disregarded. The Ukrainian armed forces, having modernized its doctrine during the period 2014 to 2022, put up a heavier resistance than Russian expectations. As far as can be asserted, the Russian plan was to quickly take the major cities, and especially the airports close to Kiev, and so supply their heavier ground forces either via air or railway. They also wanted to capture the sitting president, drive west, take Odessa, and make a land bridge to Transnistria. Bold goals for a relatively small force of approximately 200,000 men. So expectations from the Russian side must have been weak to no resistance at all. When Ukrainian forces stopped Russian airborne troops from taking the airports around Kiev, that blocked the Russian army's plan. Slowly, with heavy casualties, they started to encircle the capital, but were finally forced to pull back because of losses and poor logistics. In the south, they first made quick progress from Crimea, capturing Kherson, but after that their westward drive slowed down considerably. Mariupol, also in the south, held out, making the Russian operations in the south problematic to say the least. Constant attacks by Russian and Russian proxy forces in the Donbas area have gained little so far. The Russian army seems to be feeding units one at a time, unable to concentrate a force for a major offensive. The Battalion Tactical Group, BTG, have also shown its weaknesses. Lacking infantry makes it rather poor for combat in urban areas or other infantry-heavy operations. The flexible small force it is intended to be have not been achieved. Lack of own initiative, probably as a result of not being able to create an effective NCO cadre, bad logistics, and no overall plan seems all to have contributed to the bad performance of the Russian army. They are now focusing on only capturing the Donbas region, and have pulled out from most of the northern parts of Ukraine. The lack of air superiority has been surprising, as well as the lack of tactical or a strategical execution on the ground. The war is ongoing as of early May of 2022. There are several similarities between the Russian armed forces of today with the Red Army of 1941. Both had large stockpiles of, on paper, effective military hardware. They had a large army and some sound strategies and doctrine. But under stress they both seem to come apart. In 1941 the large tank force was stopped by bad maintenance, problems with logistics, and most of all bad communication. Back then most tanks would communicate via flags in the Red Army. Today the flags are still there, but now in the form of open communication that anyone can listen in on. They spent money on a communication system that simply did not work. Logistically, back then and today, it's still hampered by the fact that it is a railway-based system with too few trucks. They simply do not have the carrying capacity to strike further than around 145 kilometers from its railway hub. And the loss of trucks will directly impact operations. In 1941 they also lacked trucks, so they could not deliver fuel, ammunition, food or spare parts to units, making them combat ineffective. We saw exactly the same thing in 2022 outside Kiev, where a force relatively close to the capital was stopped in great parts based on bad logistics. Both armies were actually armies in being, more fearful before they were met and less so after. Both had some numerical advantages. In 1941 the Red Army had its manpower, and that is not the case for Russia 2022, where manpower is a big problem. The artillery systems have always been their main weapons and their main numerical advantage. This is especially true in 2022. The Soviet Union had a large air force with some capable planes, but they were virtually eliminated by the German actions in the beginning of Operation Barbarossa. The Russian Federation Air Force have not been eliminated, but at least halted for some now unknown reason. Maybe it is a paper tiger, much more on paper, less so in reality. That said, we cannot know why the Russian Air Force did not succeed in Ukraine. We can only see that it didn't. The difference between 1941 and 2022 is that, unlike World War II, there is no lend-lease for Russia to get military hardware. Right now it simply looks like the Russian army will become weaker and not stronger over time. The Russian army has struggled since the fall of the Soviet Union and its conception in the early 1990s. An army based on conscripts with a lot of aging hardware and little funding, hampering all reforms in the early 90s to mid-2000. They did manage to reduce their standing army from 4 million men down to approximately 1 million soldiers. Prioritizing the nuclear forces have left the conventional forces still struggling in 2022 with similar problems they had back in 1994. They have mimicked Western armies by switching to smaller tactical units, going from division to brigades as the standard unit. However, they seem to have retained the Cold War mentality. They have had problems creating a flexible officer corps, something smaller units need to be effective. Examples of this are their attempts to create a non-commissioned officer class, without actually using them as such. Western officers will have a target, and based on training, experience, and the current situation, they can solve the mission in any flexible way. A Russian officer will instead have a couple of set ways to solve a current mission, A, B, C, and so on, and they simply pick a predetermined course of action. That is not really a flexible way to deal with a fast-moving modern battlefield. The problem in communication have been haunting the Russian army since 1994. The fundamental of being able to act quickly on a fast-moving modern battlefield is lacking in the Russian army. In Georgia in 2008, Russian commanders had to borrow satellite phones from journalists to be able to communicate. In Ukraine 2022, their secure mobile communication network was stopped by Ukraine simply blocking Russian phone numbers, or themselves striking mobile towers. So they had to revert to open channel communications, which will not only give the enemy a fix on what they are doing, but also where they are. And they have suffered casualties as a consequence. The domestic armaments industry has had trouble delivering new hardware systems, as can be seen by the T-14 Armata tank. It has shown ineffectiveness, optimistic goals, and some modernizations like the T-72 has not been a success. Corruption would most likely be the cause. It will be difficult for them to correct this in the near to mid-term. Logistic is also an Achilles heel for them. The Russian army is a railway-tied army, which makes flexible choices in large-scale conflicts problematic. This could be seen in the attack against Kiev 2022. In general, they have a maximum distance of around 145 kilometers from the nearest railway hub for any large force. Any longer than that, and they have to repair or have access to railway transport. Maintenance is another issue they are struggling with. Simply rotating tires on trucks to avoid premature damage has not been done, and stored tanks have not been maintained properly. They have a large amount of tanks in storage, but maintenance of them has been a problem since 1991. And it must be questioned how many tanks in storage could actually be made combat effective in any reasonable time frame. The biggest surprise in 2022 is how much the Air Force has underperformed in Ukraine. They have not managed to get air superiority, and rather fewer planes have been deployed. Russia had a ratio of 14-1 against Ukraine. This is baffling and against their own hybrid warfare concept. Possibly they do not want to lose a large amount of airplanes, or they do not see the need for it. Perhaps pilots are not trained enough. Probably they have a lack of precision ammunition. And I would also guess that they have overstated how many combat-ready airplanes they actually have. The Russian army have overwhelmed smaller countries by sheer numbers, and so hid many shortcomings. In Ukraine they can still win by numbers, but Ukraine has a population of over 40 million, and the numbers are now not all in favor of the Russian army. The hybrid warfare concept has shown effectiveness in previous conflicts, like the annexation of Crimea. But in Ukraine 2022 it has also shown its weaknesses. When met with sufficient force, the collaboration between proxy forces and the Russian armed forces does not provide instant results. The political aspects will struggle unless they attain a quick victory. Western powers have probably surprised Russia in their support for Ukraine, and so the political part of threatening and blackmailing is now working against Russia. More countries are moving closer to NATO, and one aim of Russia's invasion of Ukraine was to stop NATO expansion. Its army has proven much weaker than expected, which makes its position weaker on the world stage. It is still an artillery army that only seems able to win by artillery and nothing else. On paper, they have tried to create a flexible, professional force, but fundamentally it has proven not to be one. It is still trapped in the large-scale mindset of a World War II army. Some units are probably highly effective, but overall the army seems not to be. the many fundamental flaws would take years to correct. The loss of hardware and the loss of perceived power will affect its armed forces for decades.